We're celebrating Camp's 70th birthday, so we're trying to obviously incorporate an open house with all sorts of fun events to celebrate that this place has been an integral part of so many kids and people's lives for the past 70 years. I've met a lot of wonderful people today that have so many different connections with camp. It's touched a lot of people's lives and benefited a lot of people, so it's wonderful to be here to celebrate with everyone else who loves camp so much.
Camp Marshall celebrated its 70th birthday in 2022. Located on McCormick Road in Spencer, Massachusetts, the property consists of close to 250 acres that include trails, waterfront, and fields. Before settling on the property in Spencer, 4-H camp was held in multiple locations between 1929 and 1946. The first camp season was held in 1929 in Greenwich, Massachusetts, with a dozen or so campers. Early locations also included Otter River State Forest in Baldwinville, Massachusetts, Camp Wickabog in Brookfield, Massachusetts, and Camp Farley on Cape Cod. Leon Marshall, also known as Skip Marshall, established the permanent location of 4-H camp on Thompson Pond in Spencer in 1946. Skip Marshall spent countless hours at camp, often with his family, including his wife, Martha.
Skip was quite a guy, and he was very much involved with camp. Camp was his thing, him and his wife. They loved camp. He stayed there most of the time.
I remember going out to camp I guess it's called Smiley Hall these days, and honoring Skip for all the work that he did, and he was there and he told stories.
I don't remember it, but my parents tells of a story how myself and Skip Marshall was wandering through the camp and were sprayed by a skunk.
Before Mr. Marshall acquired the property for 4-H, it was used as a camp by the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC, was established through the Emergency Conservation Work Act, passed in 1933 under President Franklin Roosevelt. The purpose of the CCC was to provide employment for unemployed young men. Projects included forestation, planting trees, soil erosion control, and building drainage systems, to name a few. By 1942, the program was being phased out.
My grandfather was part of the CCC during the Depression, which is interesting because I've heard lately that they were single men, but my grandfather was married with a family.
The CCC camp on McCormick Road operated for years. During that time, several buildings were built on the property, some of which are still there today, including the Craft House and the Director's Lodge. The Mess Hall, later named Smiley Hall, also a CCC building, burned down in the 1980s.
My favorite spot, obviously the mess hall was huge. It was such a sad thing when that burnt down.
The mess hall was a campy indoor facility, but that's where we had all our meals. Later on, it was named for a man, Bob Smiley, who had many years as an agent contributing to this camp.
Smiley Hall was the dining hall. We did dining hall, we had rainy day activities in there. That was a meeting place for campers when we had the Lost Swimmer drills or Lost Camper drills, or, you know, it was just the hub of camp.
The CCC barracks, no longer on the property, were used in the early days of 4-H camp. Much work had been done before the property was ready for use by campers. Improvements were continuously made over the years.
The old cabins, or the original cabins, were very dark, always smelled kind of musty. They were, you know, cobwebs and everything. Didn't matter how much you cleaned. It was camp and it was dark wood.
Well, I loved staying in a cabin with other campers. That was it was really fun just to have a bunch of kids your age, and it was just like a big slumber party, and we got to tell stories, and by the end of the week you felt like you were best friends with everybody in your cabin.
The first cabin, called the Bolton Cabin, was built in 1951.
My grandfather built one of the cabins at camp, and I believe it was cabin 4 or cabin 5. They were done by the towns. Each town had one.
Off-season, of course, you go through the camp and you see what has to be repaired. We started just to perk the camp up a little bit and put in a little more plumbing.
Oh, the plumbing, that was such a joyous time that we actually had flush toilets for the first year. And I think we might have had running hot water at that point too.
A look at the maintenance done in the 1960s gives a good snapshot of the amount of work needed to keep the camp up to date and to add improvements. According to the Camp Center meeting minutes, there were frequent repairs and updates throughout the camp. The buildings were and are important, but the real reflection of camp is in the testimonies of those who were involved with the camp over the years.
As a 6-month-old child was my first time at camp. My mother was the camp nurse back in the 50s, and my father was the assistant director. So through the years, I grew up knowing camp, knowing the changes. I became a camper in the late 60s, and on to become a CIT, and then a counselor up until 1972.
First I did 2 summers just as the summer camp director, and then I ran it full-time for about 4 years. And those kids took all things like swimming and arts and crafts, but then we had a full horse camp for horse owners. That was quite extensive, and we had a horse show every Friday. The kids got a lot of experience, and we took them on trail rides. But I was working with a woman who was a horse person, so she helped so much. Her name is Louise Andrews, and she was fabulous. So the campers decided that I needed to get on a horse. So they put me on what's called a quarter horse, because the quarter horse is not it's very tame, low-key. And they brought me down and they set me in the ring, and all the horse campers were there, and it was the best laugh they had of the entire season to see me trying to trot on a horse.
When I first started working with Camp Marshall. I did a lot of volunteer hours down along the Turkey Hill Brook. Basically, I did a project where I reopened a trail, or did a fair amount of work on the trail. One of the things that lure me to be involved in the camp is the fact that the camp provides just great access to the outdoors, to nature, to agriculture. I mean, the waterfront's amazing.
The waterfront has always been another favorite place of both campers and staff, and has seen changes and improvements over the years.
My standout was teaching kids to swim early morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, getting them in the water. You know, that and just having the little kids. And I would have the older campers that had passed everything would come down during the last period of camp, and they would teach the younger campers. And that's how I got a lot of my staff once they turned old enough to be staff members.
I went through the stages. I was a CIT to a counselor, and then zoned in on the waterfront and ended up as the waterfront director. I loved it. I was a water bug. I'd always been around it, and it was, I think, the most fun place to be.
When I was a counselor, I taught boating classes, and it was really fun. We had a bunch of kayaks, canoes, and some paddle boats. The pond was kind of the perfect size for kids who are a little bit more skilled at boating. They could go out to the little bridge on the other side of the pond and go through that, and kids who were still learning could keep close to the dock, which was really nice. If anyone was feeling extra adventurous, they would get up before breakfast to do a polar bear swim. So they would swim early in the morning.
The summer that I was the camp director, I stayed in the lodge down close to the waterfront. And that area sort of became a nice spot because it was close to the waterfront, and you could observe things going on there with the canoes and swimming lessons and so forth. The next building to the lodge was the Arts and Crafts building, and I could wander over there and see what was going on.
The Arts and Crafts House, one of the original CCC buildings, has not changed much over the years, and its history is literally written on the walls with clear impressions of a much-loved space.
The craft shop brings back lots of fond memories of helping kids do things, especially because I am not crafty. And many of the campers were so much better than I was.
My favorite space at camp is definitely the field and like the art shack and the lake, because I love going there during free time and just like painting and making bracelets and stuff like that.
Worked in the craft house, also in the boating and canoeing area, and then to help with the different soccer games that we used to have and stuff like that.
The staff members each had a commodity, if you will, that they dealt with during a regular day: arts and crafts, bow and arrow, sports, games, and so forth.
My responsibilities at camp were, at 14, that very first year, I had a full cabin of kids. There were probably anywhere from 6 to 8 girls in the cabin. I had to sleep in the cabin. We had 3 activities in the morning, and I had to work at the activity that I was assigned at. It could be the craft shop, it could be helping at the waterfront. I had to sit with my campers for every meal, make sure we had someone to set the table, make sure we had somebody to clear because it was family style serving.
I remember the one class I did teach, it was a tumbling class. We used mattresses and we met in the pole barn.
I worked in the kitchen at camp. We would get in first thing in the morning, like 5:30 or so, and we would right away get busy on the muffins. We'd feed the horse campers early because they had been up early taking care of their horses, and then we would feed them at 7 o'clock, and we would feed the Camp Marshall kids usually around 8:15, and then right away, as soon as we cleaned up after them, we would get busy making rolls. We served a lot of young people. Easily, at that time, we had about 200 Camp Marshall campers, and then we had about 90 horse camp campers.
Swim lessons, we might have anywhere from 8 to 10. Depends on the cabin size, and then within the cabin size, because they would depend on levels, where they were as far as how they could swim. Classes were in the morning. In the afternoon, there was free swim, general swim. Very rarely did we have any evening kind of programs at the waterfront. If anything, it was going out in the canoes. Evening programs, there was always something different that was going on. Monday was always capture the flag. Wednesdays were the dances, Thursdays were concerts in the Glen, and of course Fridays were the end of the week ceremony. And then I remember week to week, the dances were always a very big deal. We would bring, our fanciest the summer type dresses. There was hair, there was makeup, there was all kinds of things going on. Sometimes there were theme weeks for the dances. And I remember one in particular, it was prom week. And so all of us, this was when I was a counselor, brought our prom gowns and our prom wear and wore those to the dance. And it was just an absolute ball. It was so much fun.
Every Wednesday night there was a dance. And then some other activities we had would be carnival theme or capture the flag. The kids too had, they did campfire skits and, karaoke nights. The last night of camp was this Mr. Marshall pageant.
Every Friday night we had a wonderful campfire, and it was set down in the Glen in the lower part of the camp. And when you went in there, you weren't like being in a planetarium, you were the planetarium because it was surrounded by trees, so you looked up and all you saw were the stars. And that was beautiful.
The end of the week ceremony was amazing, just in the preparation for it, and it was so fun being part of that and going into the woods and searching for these ginormous logs and setting that up and then setting up the spirit fires. And then having the ceremony of it with everyone coming in after we lowered the flag, everyone walking into the Glen and getting set up, and everyone had their candles, of course, and then the reading of the story of the firebringer, and then actually having someone come in dressed as the firebringer with the live torch and come around and light the main fire.
Down in the Glen, they would build a big bonfire, and they would have the story of the firebringer. I was the reader for a good number of camps because I had a loud voice and could speak over the roar of the fires.
After dinner, we'd go down to the craft house, and a couple of the counselors would paint me up, and then for the candlelighting services, Bob Smiley would be reading the story, and at a certain point we would light the torch, and then I would come up running up through the Glen and light the main campfire. One of the funny stories about that was the story was about a young Indian boy and a coyote who brought fire to his village. And at one of the ceremonies, as I came running up through the Glen, there was a dog following me, so it kind of fit in with the story they were reading. So that was pretty neat.
The spirit fires were related to the 4-H creed. Let me see if I can remember it. I pledge my head to clearing thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, my health to better living for my club, my community, my country, and my world. So each of the spirit fires for the end of the week ceremony had to do with the 4-H pledge: head, heart, hands, and health. And the campers were chosen for those. Throughout the week, staff would kind of take note and pay attention, and then we would have a meeting and decide which campers, it was always a boy and a girl, which campers would go for each of the 4 fires.
The camp spirit was the center fire for the campfire on Friday night. And then we did head, heart, hands, and health. There were some weeks that it was so obvious. We just knew exactly who we were going to choose for spirit and for each one. And it was really pretty sweet because as counselors, we would all vie for who would get to escort those kids to that honor. And that was a smaller, the head, heart, hands, and health was a smaller fire from the central fire, and they would get to light their campfire from the large fire.
I remember come Friday night, of course, there the camp, that's when you have your campfires and things. And I looked and all of a sudden my parents were there, and I said, "What are you doing here?" Of course, they wouldn't say, "Oh, we're just checking it out." Well, come to find out afterwards at the campfire, I got picked to be camp spirit. And it was quite an excitement. And I always remember that.
At least 60 years ago, maybe 65 years ago, we used to come to a family camp, and it was wonderful. We had a great time doing that.
Family camp, that happened at Friday night after all the kids left. The families would come in, and each family had their own cabin, and that was great. The parents, we used to get together and have fun and play cards and joke around, and Skip Marshall was there, and Jim Mahoney, and his wife Dorothea, and I don't know, quite a few of us, and we had some great times. Myself, my kids, we've been involved in 4-H for quite a few years. I've been a leader now going on 70 years. My kids showed cows at the fair. Eventually, I was in charge of the dairy and the beef, getting judges and so forth and so on. And it was great. We had a lot of fun. Lots of fun at the 4-H fair.
From my understanding, 4-H fair started in the late 1940s. My wife Priscilla, former Priscilla Standish, and her mother, Evangeline Standish, were involved in the 4-H fair for almost from the beginning. And my wife and I, to a lesser extent, continue to be involved in the fair. It was held at the campgrounds until, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Always something that the kids looked forward to because it was the week before the Spencer Fair, and it marked the end of their really active summer because of all of the things involved in the fair, showing animals, growing things in their garden, arts and crafts, photography, all of the things that 4-H kids get involved in. This was their time to show it off.
When camp went to the 6 weeks, the fair would be that following weekend, and the counselors would be asked to stay if they could. And because a lot of the people who worked at the fair worked really hard and they needed to use the cabins. The counselors often would go around and make sure everything was okay and there wasn't any mischief, so to speak, going on at camp. And then as the fair would wind down, we would have to move all the mattresses from the cabins into the craft house. So, and we had to pick things up at the waterfront, et cetera, et cetera. So the counselors often helped close up camp, but we would often stay and help and be extra hands for the county fair.
When I was 12 was the first time I came to camp. It was to exhibit my pig named Curly at the 4-H fair, and she got a blue ribbon and she got a rosette, which I was so excited, how proud I was of her because she got a rosette, and then she proceeded to eat it after I hung it on the fence.
My memories about the 4-H fair were that the exhibit hall was actually the mess hall that we called it back then. It wasn't the Smiley Hall. And you know, I look at pictures today of that lonely looking little slab and it seems so small. But back then the dining, we called it the dining hall or the mess hall, had a beautiful, beautiful stone fireplace at one end. But during 4-H fair time, the tables were set up in the hall for exhibits like flowers and vegetables and all the things that were exhibited. I believe what we call the pole barn, I don't know if they still call it that now, had the chickens, and the dairy cattle were up across the street where Andrews Hall is now.
Things changed when Andrews Hall was built, which was in the early 1980s, when they went from it being just basically a shell of a building, a steel building, to a closed-in, more, a nicer building, actually. And the volunteers, a lot of the volunteers on the camp board, and people that just really wanted to help, came out of the woodwork and helped with the building of the Andrews Hall, and eventually the kitchen came onto that too. But I think the first time that we used Andrews Hall as the exhibit hall was in 1983.
When I was a counselor, we had all our meals up at Andrews Hall, and we sang for our food for every meal. So everybody would gather outside, and we'd form a big horseshoe shape and sing a bunch of silly camp songs, and then we'd all go in, and then we'd sing our version of Grace. And then, depending on the year or the counselor, whoever was in charge of choosing tables to go up, maybe you had to be the quietest table or the loudest table, or you had to do something really impressive, or maybe it was just luck, but you would just get chosen to get your meals that way.
For both summer camp and year-round special events, the kitchen has always been an integral part of camp.
Lori, that works in our kitchen, this is her 22nd year, I believe.
Myra Hardacre, I believe, was the cook at camp. She made the best rolls. And every night at 9 o'clock after the campers went to bed, we raided the refrigerator.
Talk to any of the counselors back then, they'll tell you the same thing. The homemade bread and the cold milk. You couldn't beat it.
We started out, a man named John Harrington was our head cook, and then Sandy Standish took over as the head cook, and we just learned so much from them. It seems like no matter how many years go by, people ask about the rolls that we used to make by hand, and it was a great recipe, and we made rolls, homemade rolls for the kids every day.
One year I worked in the kitchen under Sandy Standish, and one of my primary jobs was making peanut butter cookies. And by the large trayfuls. And I would also be responsible for mixing a 33-gallon, it was basically a trash barrel that was converted, but it was 33 gallons of orange juice.
So changes in the camp, obviously the biggest change was no mess hall. I just noticed today that it looks like the nurses' cabin is up here by Andrews Hall. Back then it was down next to the craft house.
In the late 70s, early 80s, there was a number of different building projects that happened that really, it was an amazing conglomeration of different things that came together. There was a lot of money that was available from the state of Massachusetts. It was considered to be rehab monies. It came to us in Worcester County as through the fair, because the fair was held here. But it gave a lot of funding, and we were also able to use that funding to apply for grants for like the Wells Williams Arena, the horse barns. There was a great group of volunteers, and one of the biggest leaders of those volunteers was Louise Andrews, She was the treasurer of the camp board at that time. And, well, it was the Camp Center Committee, the Worcester County 4-H Camp Center Committee. And she really spearheaded the funding, brought it all together. Albert Andrews Sr. is the great-great-great-grandpa of many of the kids that are involved today. And he just had a spirit, like a can-do style. No matter what anybody thought was impossible, he never thought it was impossible. They just got it done. And it was a great spirit that was captured during that time that really gave the camp a lot of the same buildings and property that they still use today. In fact, my dad was an electrician, and he, at that time, during part of that time, he was the president of the Camp Center Committee, and he wired the horse barns. As an electrician, he had some extra time, and so he was willing to do that.
Over the years, one of the many organizations that assisted with environmental projects was the Massachusetts Sportsman's Junior Conservation Camp. The conservation camp was located at Camp Marshall for almost 40 years, until the program relocated to Plymouth, Massachusetts in the 1990s.
Conservation camp program, it was a statewide program, and I think the local conservation offices were involved in helping to select the kids that came to it was the junior conservation camp. But it was an honor to be selected, and they were selected to come for 2 weeks. And they worked on a lot of projects right here at Buck Hill. They worked on a lot of projects at camp, and they really had a goal of learning about the environment, but also making the place to be more beautiful. They did a lot of conservation activities here at Buck Hill.
There were a few years where kids could spend a night camping out on Buck Hill. A couple counselors would take them out there, and then they would just pitch a tent and stay there overnight as a little adventure, part of the survival skills class, I think.
Buck Hill and the 4-H Center, Camp Marshall, and all the area around was the center of the Snowbirds Snowmobile Club. It was a lot of fun back then.
Buck Hill trails are still used and maintained, in part by the Snowbirds Snowmobile Club.
The development of a horse program at the Worcester County 4-H Center, and as such with camp and the 4-H fair, has grown tremendously over the years, to the point where at the center it's a year-round proposition now. The Wells Williams Arena is there and open all winter. They give riding lessons and so forth.
The first annual 4-H horse camp was held at the Worcester County 4-H Center at Camp Marshall in the 1960s. The facility has been extremely popular since the horse program began.
When I started here at Camp Marshall, the horse camp was run separately from Camp Marshall. It started out as only being kids who came with their horses. They owned horses, and they spent the whole week with their horse, taking care of their horse. Then when it broadened, they added the Horse Lovers Camp. The Horse Lovers Camp was a combination of 3 children that shared a horse and took care of that horse for the whole week. Jean Cassavant did a really good job with the horse programs. She put a lot of effort into year-round horse programming. She was very determined. She had a vision for Camp Marshall, and she tried her very best to make that vision move forward.
One of the improvements during Jean Cassavant's directorship was the addition of a fishing pier built in collaboration with a local Eagle Scout.
Hi everybody, welcome. I'm Andrea Desolitz, President of the Camp Marshall Board of Directors. Thanks everyone for joining us on this great occasion. We're very, very thankful for Tim. He chose Camp Marshall to do his Eagle Scout project. And as you can see, this beautiful fishing dock was his project. He raised the money and built it himself, and we are the beneficiary for that.
So I've been here at Camp Marshall for roughly seven or 8 years, and so I've worked with 2 directors, with Jean Cassavant and our current director, who's Cheryl Moore. As part of the board, you're involved in some of the decision making, right? I mean, we trust that our directors are good to go, and you know, they're high caliber folks, at least the 2 that I've worked with. Being a teacher, I do find myself more available in the summertime, so I do pop in, you know, here and there during the summertime. It's a real fun time around here.
In the summer, obviously, is the bulk of what we do with our summer camp. Depending on the way the summer runs, it's anywhere from 9 to 10 weeks of summer programming. So it's a pretty intense 2 months, and that's when our staff explodes to, you know, a little bit more than, you know, 60 some summers. We also have the year-round equestrian facility. That's part of the year-round operations. The equestrian director oversees care for all of our camp horses as well as some border horses. So we have lesson program year-round with that. We have a small staff year-round, which does an awful lot as far as keeping the property up, planning for the camp season, hosting shoulder season events such as weddings, graduation parties. So there's a lot of different things happening at camp. Some of my favorites are like our Halloween event. So we host a trunk or treat for the community in this haunted campground that brings in a lot of people, that something fun to do for the holidays. So whatever we can do to bring the community together and use the resources of this space to benefit everyone.
I think the most important thing about my camp experience has probably been learning how to talk to people better and socialize and be positive.
The camp just has a lot of really fun traditions that you look forward to every year, and you know, new ones pop up, but it just, when you go back to camp every summer, it just feels like this little community that you've been a part of. It was just an exciting place to be.
Kids should go to camp because it's a great experience for them to be away. They can experience stuff that they normally would not experience. They get to swim in a lake where there's fish. They can do horseback riding, archery, stuff that normally they wouldn't get a chance to do. My daughter was at camp the whole time I was here, and she loved being at camp.
I couldn't wait to go every year. I would start planning in February what I was going to take. And just the whole buildup of the excitement of being able to go and be with people that I had gotten to know, and in an environment that was very supportive.
It was a terrific way for me, personally, to spend the summer. But it's also a great place and a great time for youngsters to spend a summer. And for the staff, because most of them were college-age students. It was a good summer job for them, and if any of them were interested in perhaps a career in education they were thinking about, it's a good place to be around children and deal with children, and they might learn, well, this is either for me or it's not for me. It's a pretty good situation all around.
Camp definitely was one of the things that shaped my life, and is something that still dwells within me. Whether a song comes on that I hear and it reminds me of camp, I have to sing along. With my nieces and nephews, I would sing camp songs with them. In my teaching years, I would use camp songs there, and it's amazing how Camp Marshall permeates your life, and at least for mine it did. And what an incredible thing, and what an incredible opportunity that is, and what a wonderful history there is to be able to keep doing that summer after summer after summer, and having just different generations come through camp.
Kids should come to camp because it's a wonderful place to be. It's, structured fun, but not too structured. It's a great place to be whoever you are, to be comfortable just being yourself. I mean, that's one of the great things about working at camp, is that you can just have fun and be who you are as an adult too, which is great. You get to kind of try new things. It's an unbelievable place to meet new friends. So not only you might make friends that, are local, but maybe some friends from far away that can become lifelong friends. That's one of the great things I've seen today is, some of these camp alum who, they still keep those connections today, which is wonderful.
Camp Marshall is it's a great place. I think there's something here for everybody. One of the things Camp Marshall really could use, I would say, moving forward, is volunteers, primarily board members, just people who have passion for the outdoors, for youth, and the opportunities that this camp can provide. If anyone's interested in volunteering at Camp Marshall, your best bet would be to contact Cheryl Moore right at Camp Marshall.